Hello and welcome to Gus McDowell Strategy and Tactics, and thank you to our subscribers. I'm Nick McDowell. In this episode we will take a short break from the battles in Operation Marketgarden to examine historical World War II British tank doctrine. Please remember to like the video and subscribe for more great strategy and tactics content. And if you want to buy me a coffee, the links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. So far in this series, we have completed Day 3 of the Arnhem campaign, 19 September 1944. Our battles in the morning were decisive, so by 1100 hours the battlefield goes quiet. There will be no more action today. Instead, both forces consolidate and prepare for the fighting tomorrow. Also, 30 Corps has moved through Eindhoven and has reached the outskirts of Nijmegen city. In practical terms, this means we will see more battles using British armour in support of American and British infantry. This morning, for example, we saw British tanks in support of American paratroops at Zon South. So this is a good moment to take the afternoon off, settle in with a hot cup of tea, and revise British tank doctrine. In this episode, I want to give you a quick overview of historical World War II British tank doctrine and tactics, British tank types, and how we can use these in a game devoted to infantry close combat at the company level and below. Having invented tanks during World War I to break the deadlock on the Western Front, the British experimented with tank doctrine and tactics in the interwar period. They emerged with a particular concept for the employment of armour and for tanks as part of the armoured force. This concept was documented in a number of key publications, and it drove their doctrine, tank design and development, and tactics. First among these publications was our familiar friend, the United Kingdom Field Service Regulations, Volume 2, Operations General, from 1935. This document set out warfighting doctrine for the Army as a whole, including armoured doctrine. In other words, high-level principles for how to use armour along with other capabilities such as infantry, anti-tank guns, artillery, engineers, and so on. It covers the use of tanks and other armoured vehicles in the attack, the defence, night operations, and position warfare. Within this broad conceptual framework for combined arms were other more specific documents that outlined armoured doctrine. One example is the Mobile Division Training Pamphlet No. 2, Notes on the Employment of the Tank Brigade, from 1938. This document specified how tank brigades and battalions would operate within their concept of employment. Tank tactics was specified in other even more specific documents. For example, Troop Training for Cruiser Tank Troops from 1941 contained the tactics that enabled squadrons, troops, and individual tank crews to implement the doctrine at the tactical level. And of course, individual tank models and weapon systems had their own technical manuals. So, how did the British use tanks in World War II? In the interwar period between the First and Second World Wars, the British Army had a concept of battle. Infantry divisions would conduct an initial assault to penetrate and create a gap in the enemy front line, much like in the First World War. Mobile or armoured divisions would then move through and exploit the gap to capture territory and disrupt the enemy in depth. And they would be followed by motorised infantry to hold what had been captured. So, British doctrine saw two distinct roles for tanks. The primary role for British tanks was mobile operations. Highly mobile forces of light and medium tanks would form the main striking portion for decisive action. They would operate in self-contained mixed tank battalions. The mix consisted of medium tanks, the principal assault weapon of the battalion. There would also be support tanks, what we today would call self-propelled artillery, firing HE and smoke shells. Finally, the battalion would have light tanks for reconnaissance and for neutralising enemy anti-tank units. These mixed battalions would operate independently of the infantry divisions. This was seen as the main battle-winning role for tanks. The secondary role was close cooperation with infantry in the attack and counter-attack. In this role, tanks would accompany the infantry in the attack to destroy enemy machine gun emplacements and strongpoints, and also to counter hostile tanks. For this purpose, heavy tanks were organised into Army tank battalions. These were completely separate from the mixed tank battalions that made up the tank brigades. The Employment of the Tank Brigade pamphlet sets out this distinction well. It states, "On the one hand, we have the Army tank battalions with their thick armour, inevitable weight, slow speed, and limited range, and a complete reliance on the support of other arms. On the other hand, the Tank Brigade battalions with comparatively light armour, speed, extreme flexibility, extended circuit of action, and self-containment as regards reconnaissance, protection, and supporting fire." What is clear to modern eyes in this statement is that while the British integrated tanks into a combined arms concept at the operational level, tank brigades themselves were not at all integrated at the tactical level. tactical integration was left to the infantry tanks of the Army tank battalions. And the wording of this paragraph and its selective use of adjectives conveys considerable condescension towards those tanks that support infantry. Note, for example, the contemptuous reference to complete reliance on the support of other arms, in other words, combined arms. As the war developed, the British gained experience in tank warfare against the Germans. The Germans used combined arms at the tactical level, and with great success. They formed flexibly task-organised Kampfgruppe with whatever assets were to hand that best met the needs of the situation. Gradually, the condescending pre-war doctrine crumbled before the brutal reality of modern combat. Slowly, the British Army changed the organisation of its armoured forces with 9 major restructures over the course of the war. And 30 Corps was at the forefront of the fighting and the learning, first in North Africa, then in Sicily, and finally in Northwest Europe. Amongst the changes was for the armoured division to include an armoured brigade, infantry brigade, and artillery brigade, and to include a motorised infantry battalion within the armoured brigade. At marketgarden, the Guards Armoured Division contained both an armoured brigade and an infantry brigade, as well as divisional troops including Army tank battalions. And the 5th Guards Armoured Brigade consisted of 3 armoured battalions and 1 motorised infantry battalion. So, following the ambush of the 2nd Armoured Battalion of the Irish Guards, south of Valkenswaard on day 1, it was the infantry of the 3rd Battalion of the Irish Guards that cleared their flanks and allowed the tank advance to continue. In this example, infantry supported armour. But the infantry were from the 32nd Guards Brigade, a different brigade than the tanks, so coordinating this support was a job for the divisional commander, a major general, not the squadron or company commander, a major. A lot more than 7 letters separates those ranks, and it is telling that British infantry tank cooperation still needed to be coordinated at a divisional level. Elsewhere, divisional troops operating separately from the armoured brigade would fulfil a role similar to the original Army tank battalions. Individual tank squadrons and troops were attached to or worked with infantry units during the battle. Examples include the 15th 19th Hussars, equipped with Cromwell tanks, fighting with the 101st Airborne at Nederwetten, or the Shermans from the 44th Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment, fighting with the 101st Airborne at Neuenen. In these cases, armour supported infantry. While this cooperation was intentional, it was also ad hoc. It was not underpinned by doctrine or well rehearsed. At Nederwetten and Neuenen, British tanks and American infantry were thrown together shortly before going into battle. On other occasions, infantry and tank cooperation was purely coincidental, and the results reflected this. One example was the actions following the crossing of the Waal Canal near Nijmegen, and the meeting up between 30 Corps tanks that crossed the bridge and paratroops from the 82nd Airborne who had crossed the river. So, by September 1944, British tank doctrine retained much of its pre-war origins, but had been influenced to incorporate a little bit of combined arms thinking at the tactical level, but never to the same extent as the German Kampfgruppe. A consistent criticism of British armoured brigades throughout the war was the lack of balance between armour and the support of other arms. British tanks never really saw themselves as supporting the infantry, rather the other way round. To give effect to their doctrine, the British divided tanks into 2 broad types. The first was light or medium tanks designed for mobile operations, sacrificing armour for speed. These were sometimes called cruiser tanks. The second type was slow, heavily armoured tanks intended to support the infantry in the attack. These were called infantry tanks. Indeed, the 1938 Field Service Regulations clearly stated, tanks are designed either to take part in mobile operations, for which speed and a wide circuit of action are essential at some sacrifice of armoured protection, or for close cooperation with infantry in the attack, for which armour is of more importance than speed or a wide circuit. Tanks of the former type are classified as either light or medium, those of the latter are called infantry tanks. This division of labour was reflected throughout the war in both the design of British tanks and the roles assigned to tanks, whether built in Britain or imported from America. I should also take a moment to discuss British military symbols for tanks. So far in this series, I've used a field-modified version of standard post-war NATO military symbols for all forces involved in Operation Marketgarden. This is because they are reasonably easy to access and understand. But in fact, the British used very different military symbols. The Field Service Pocketbook on Conventional Military Symbols from 1943 sets out British military symbols as they were actually used during the Second World War. I could probably do an episode just on British military symbols in World War II, but here are some key symbols for tanks. On the left are unit symbols for armour, tanks, armoured reconnaissance, and armoured cars. These symbols would be placed above a flag, with the flag denoting unit size. On the right are equipment symbols for cruiser or medium tanks, infantry tanks, carriers, and armoured cars. So, as shown at the bottom, a tank troop could be depicted either as one troop using a unit symbol or as 3 or 4 individual tanks using equipment symbols. Finally, let's consider how we can apply historical World War II British tank doctrine and tactics to improve our experience of A Bridge Too Far and other games in the Close Combat series. Close Combat A Bridge Too Far models a number of different armoured vehicles available to the British. I've tried to divide these vehicles by their doctrinal role. I've used a bit of creative license here. As I mentioned, there were occasions during marketgarden when Cromwells and Shermans from divisional troops directly supported infantry. For mobile operations, we have medium cruiser tanks. Into this category go the Mark 7E Cromwell, the Mark 4C Sherman Firefly, the Mark II Sherman with a 75mm gun, and the Mark 4A Sherman 76 with a 76mm gun. For light tanks, we have the Daimler 4 armed with a machine gun, and the Mark V Stuart with a 37mm gun. For support tanks, we have the Achilles with a 3-inch anti-tank gun, the Achilles II with a 17-pounder anti-tank gun, and the Mark 4B Sherman 105 with a 105mm howitzer. For infantry support, we have the Churchill Mark IV AVRE, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, with a 290mm mortar, and the Crocodile Mark VII with a flamethrower. And for armoured cars and support vehicles, we have the M3A2 half-track with a 50-caliber heavy machine gun, and the M21 half-track with an 81mm mortar. There are some limitations we must accept. First, tank action will be at the troop level and below, that is, between 1 and 4 tanks at most. No dashing squadron or battalion manoeuvres here. Second, tanks will always be used either in support of infantry or against enemy AFVs, both traditional roles for infantry tanks. There is little role for tactical reconnaissance or exploitation. Third, most maps are a couple of 100 metres across. This makes for limited engagement distances for tanks. The close terrain also restricts armoured mobility, which doctrinally was the basic principle underlying the employment of armour in the mixed tank battalions. So here is how I propose to apply historical British World War II tank doctrine and tactics to the close combat games. First, when selecting my forces, as far as possible I will try to match tanks with their historical doctrinal roles. For example, I will choose medium and support tanks when facing enemy AFVs, light tanks for reconnaissance or to knock out enemy anti-tank guns, and infantry tanks against entrenched infantry positions. I will also select them in pairs of similar tanks, so 2 cruisers or 2 support tanks and so on. Tanks never worked alone by choice. Alternatively, I will reflect the capabilities of a mixed tank battalion by choosing 1 medium, 1 light and 1 support tank and see how this works. But you would not usually expect to see cruisers, such as Shermans, working with infantry tanks, such as Churchills or Crocodiles. Second, I will plan battles using historical doctrine on the employment of armour from publications such as the Field Service Regulations and from the employment of the Tank Brigade. Third, I will also employ historical tank tactics when conducting battles. For this, I will rely heavily on the Troop Training for Cruiser Tank Troops document. For example, use of formations, use of ground, actions on encountering anti-tank guns, moving through hostile streets, and actions on encountering enemy tanks. Finally, throughout the war, British tankers were constantly learning and changing their approach. Like them, I will start with the historical doctrine and tactics, but sometimes a rigid application of doctrine and tactics will put me at a considerable disadvantage. So, I will also improvise, adapt, and overcome, going with whatever works best in the tactical situation. Sometimes, I might do something that is not doctrinally sound because it works. When I do, I will try to pick this up in the lessons learned at the end of the battle. So, what did we learn? First, British tank doctrine never really emphasised combined arms or cooperation with infantry. Doctrine emphasised that tank brigades of fast, lightly armoured tanks should operate independently to conduct mobile operations. Slower heavy tanks would be used for infantry support missions and to counter enemy tanks. Second, British tank doctrine influenced the design and development of their tanks and the roles in which both British and American designed tanks were used. Different tanks would be used for mobile operations or infantry support. However, later in the war, and certainly during marketgarden, there were occasions where medium tanks such as Shermans and Cromwells operated in support of infantry. Third, close combat is a game that focuses on infantry close combat at the company level and below. Nonetheless, we can still use historical World War II British tank doctrine and tactics to improve our experience of the game. We can do this in how we select the right tanks for the mission, how we plan battles using tank doctrine, and how we fight battles using tank tactics. Well, that about wraps it up, and my tea is getting cold. I hope you enjoyed this brief interlude from the fighting. Let me know if you'd like to see more content like this. As always, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and donate, and stay tuned for the next episode.